Welcome to the Pan Am Podcast, brought to you by the Pan Am Museum in Garden City, New York. This podcast and our museum are dedicated to celebrating the legacy of the world's most iconic airline, Pan American World Airways. My name is Tom Betty, and I'm the host of this program. Thank you for joining us. The Pan Am Museum Foundation is a nonprofit organization. Our mission statement is to educate, celebrate, and inspire present and future generations by preserving historical and diverse personal stories of Pan American World Airways. Please visit our website for more information at thepanammuseum.org. Again, our website is thepanammuseum.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you are using Apple Podcasts, please consider leaving a review. It will help others discover this program. If you're not familiar with Pan Am, welcome. We are honored to have you here and for you to learn about what we're all about. If you already know of Pan Am, worked for or flown on the airline, or just love our history, it's good to be with you again. So with that, let's get this episode in the air, so to speak. Welcome aboard your Pan American Jet Clipper.
The world is about to become a smaller place. Soon you'll be able to travel a mile every 3 seconds. Well over 20 miles in just 1 minute. The phenomenal Concorde from British Airways.
You just heard the first commercial introducing Concorde by British Airways in 1975. In this episode, we explore the fascinating history of Concorde. Then we will be joined by Captain Mike Bannister, the chief pilot of British Airways Concorde fleet from 1995 to 2003, along with Jennifer Coates-Clay, Pan Am's general manager for product design and development, and before that worked on the Concorde project for British Airways, and John Lampl, a 41-year veteran executive of British Airways, who worked for the Concorde program the entire 27 years of service. But first, this episode is a direct follow-up to Episode 7, titled Supersonic Transports and Angry JFK and Flying the Line. In that episode, we explored the race for the first passenger supersonic aircraft between a British and French partnership, the United States, and the Soviet Union. We also explored the demise of the American SST project, the Boeing 2707. If you haven't already listened to this installment, we urge you to do so after listening to this episode. Pan American World Airways ordered a total of 8 Concordes, however canceled in 1973 due to the astronomical projected operating costs and the success of the subsonic and far less expensive Boeing 747 jumbo jet. In fact, the Boeing 747 was originally designed to be a transitional aircraft. In the 1960s, most estimates predicted that by 1990, passenger supersonic aircraft, also known as SSTs, would be commonplace and would replace subsonic commercial passenger aircraft. The 747 was designed to be versatile, and when the SSTs were ready for the airlines, the 747 fleet would be then converted to cargo aircraft. By 1974, even though the British and French won the race for the SST, there was growing doubts on if Concorde would ever enter passenger service. Almost all of the airlines, including Pan Am and TWA, canceled their orders, and the development and projected operational costs continued to skyrocket, not to mention the oil crisis throughout the 1970s. The political leadership and economic landscape in both countries was shifting, and the future of the program was uncertain. Let's take a listen to a May 5th, 1974 report from Morley Safer from the American news program 60 Minutes.
Concorde, the Anglo-French supersonic challenge to American control of commercial aviation. Concorde means thousands of jobs in France and across the Channel in Britain. Not only jobs, but the prestige of Britain and the glory of France are at stake as well. Concorde may just be the most extraordinarily costly joint venture two nations ever launched. For now, just as Concorde seems to have proven itself, both nations are considering scrapping the plane.
For as beautiful as Concorde looks as it blazes through the sky, pushing 1,400 miles an hour, the economics of commercial aviation have made it a $2.5 billion white elephant, and no airline really wants it. But when Concorde was first conceived back in the late 50s, commercial aviation was a license to print money. Speed was the holy grail, and Boeing was the first to provide it with the 707, cutting the transatlantic trip from 12 hours to 7.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. On behalf of the flight crew and myself, I'd like to welcome you aboard Pan American's Jet Clipper to Paris. Our flight today will take us to Le Bourget Airport.
CBS sent a reporter named Bill Leonard to cover that inaugural flight.
And this year, Paris and what happens there is considerably closer to us in New York because this is the year of the jet. The year that Paris is as close as Hollywood. In a jet age, Paris is no longer something to dream about. Paris is next door. And a Pan American Jet Clipper flew us to that door in 7 hours.
Today, Leonard is 16 years older, he's everybody's boss in 60 minutes, and it still takes 7 hours to cross the Atlantic. So in the 50s, good planning dictated a plane that would take passengers beyond 600 miles an hour, beyond the sound barrier. Military aircraft had done it, but for commercial aviation, carrying 100 passengers or more economically, a whole new technology had to be created. So with great certainty, Britain and France in 1962 signed an elaborate document pooling their resources to design and build a plane to fly twice the speed of sound, a plane that would break the American hold on commercial aviation. The contract was lodged with the International Court and provided no get-out. Neither country could withdraw for technical or financial reasons. It was also the price of Britain's entry into the common market. And so Concorde was born. In Bristol, England, they were to build the engine, tail, and nose. And in Toulouse, France, the wings and fuselage. It was to become the most tested and the most expensive commercial airplane ever built. In the 60s, there was the assumption that we'd all be flying supersonically by now. The American aircraft industry, late to the game, feared a serious challenge to its domination of the commercial aircraft business. President Kennedy authorized $750 million for an American SST, a bigger and faster plane than Concorde. After 8 years and almost $1 billion and not much more than a mock-up, the project was dropped, killed by a powerful environmentalist lobby and the vivid memory of enormous cost overruns on military aircraft. There was a temptation to drop Concorde as well, but the Anglo-French plane was far advanced, and there was a question of the Russians. 2 months before Concorde's maiden flight, they flew the Tu-144. It was immediately dubbed Concordsky. And there was good reason for the striking similarity between the two planes. An espionage ring working in Toulouse had been supplying the Soviets with streams of information on the Concorde's testbed performance. 2 Soviet agents were finally taken off the Ostend to Warsaw Express with toothpaste tubes full of microfilm. 5 years later, the Russians paid dearly for their rush into the commercial SST stakes. At the Paris Air Show at subsonic speed, an overzealous Soviet pilot lost control. But foreigners were the least of the threat. The cost of the plane was soaring, from $500 million to $1 billion, and still climbing. But unless both countries agreed to cancel, neither could. So discord was saving Concorde. Next, the environmentalists, not as powerful in Britain as the U.S., and perhaps a bit extravagant in their fears. England's green and pleasant land would be devastated. Seagull eggs and airline stewardesses would become sterile. And the ancient and glorious cathedrals of England would first lose their magnificent stained glass windows, and then would all tumble down as a result of sonic boom. Every eccentric got into the act, complaining that cats had gone mad from Concorde, this days before the plane even flew. And sound engineers found before Concorde's flight that their meters had gone haywire. The bass notes of the great organs at evensong were much more powerful than Concorde's sonic boom. But the builders heeded the pollution problems and managed to reduce emissions and airport takeoff noise to those of a Boeing 707. And it was agreed that she would not break the sound barrier over populated land. But Concorde was not to be the next great leap in commercial aviation. It was this, the wide-bodied conventional jet, the Jumbo. Upstairs, downstairs, they could carry 400 people great distances. Still less than 600 miles per hour, but great economy for the airlines. Cheap to operate. And compared with Concorde's maximum payload of 120 passengers, a bargain price. $28 million each against Concorde's projected $50 million. But against that, Concorde would cross the Atlantic 4 times a day, a jumbo jet only twice. The airlines staked their future on the Jumbo, but the Jumbos provided more seats than passengers. Cheap charter fares stole millions from the scheduled airlines. And the American carriers, Concorde's biggest potential customers, went deeper into the red. The British and French launched a massive sales campaign for the plane, sending it round the world, showing the flag, showing that this was no mere peek into the future, but a viable passenger aircraft that moves at roughly the speed of a bullet. They claimed that in spite of its drawbacks, limited capacity and range, huge fuel consumption, that once fully operational, no airline could afford to be without it, at least for first-class travel on lucrative routes. But the money men in the airline said no. First Air Canada, and then by the dozens, airlines let their options lapse. The worst blow came when Pan American and TWA, within an hour of each other, canceled their order for 13 Concordes. Leaving 2 possible orders by Iran, which can afford anything, 3 for China, for a projected Peking to New York service, and only 9 firm orders for Air France and British Airways, both extensions of their own governments. A $2.5 billion misunderstanding of the economics of commercial flying. And France and Britain, both with new governments, ponder the chilling statistics that show that at $50 million a copy, the more planes they build, the more money they lose. To show a profit, they must raise the price, and orders for hundreds of planes must be renewed.
There is a link in the episode description to view this broadcast that has incredible footage from 60 Minutes. Defying all expectations, the British and French governments remained fully committed to the Concorde project and turned to their national carriers to fly them. British Airways and Air France would be the principal airlines for the duration of the aircraft service, with various financial support schemes from their respective governments. On January 21, 1976, both made aviation history by inaugurating Concorde passenger service. On that day, British Airways flew from London to Bahrain, and Air France flew from Paris to Rio. To mark the occasion, British Airways modified their call sign to Speedbird Concorde to distinguish itself from other aircraft types, which would also let air traffic controllers know of the unique abilities of the aircraft in subsequent restrictions. Air France used their normal airline call sign. Even though British Airways and Air France were the principal operators of the Concorde for most of the 27 years of service, it should be noted that Singapore Airlines had a joint operating agreement for a short time with the Singapore's livery on the left side of the aircraft. The partnership was for only 3 flights in December 1977 and then operated for almost 2 years between January 1979 to November 1980. Braniff International Airways also leased and operated Concorde subsonically between Washington Dulles and Dallas-Fort Worth airports for a short period of time from January 1979 to June 1980. Aside from these two exceptions, the Concorde was exclusive to British Airways and Air France. The Concorde had an exceptional safety record with only 2 incidents involving structural failure of the rudder in 1989 and 1992. These incidents did not involve any injuries, and the flight crew did not even know there was an issue until after landing. The only other known issue was 57 tire failures between 1976 to 2000, which is about 30 times more frequent than the expected rate of conventional aircraft. In 1979, an Air France plane experienced a tire failure that resulted in debris damaging the aircraft's fuel tank and hydraulic cables, with no injuries to passengers or crew. Again, Concorde had an exceptional safety record for the majority of its operational career. But that record would change in the summer of the year 2000. Let's take a listen to an American news report from ABC News on July 26, 2000.
On World News Tonight this Tuesday, the first Concorde ever to crash just after takeoff from Paris. 113 people are killed, which included everyone on board. It is the world's most glamorous passenger aircraft. We'll take a closer look. What's the magic, and what will this crash mean to Concorde's future? The Middle East peace talks at Camp David collapse. What happens now? And the Republicans have a full campaign team.
I believe you're looking at the next Vice President of the United States.
Governor Bush reaches into the old establishment and chooses Dick Cheney.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening. It has been quite a day. We'll get to the Middle East peace talks and the running mate for Governor Bush, but for the first time in more than 30 years in its history, a Concorde has crashed, and that's where we start. It was an Air France Concorde chartered by a German tour company. It had just taken off from Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris when something cataclysmic happened in at least one of the 4 engines. In this picture, you can see a long stream of smoke and fire as the pilot struggled to gain altitude. He failed. And when the plane crashed in the grounds of a small rural hotel in Gonesse, just outside Paris, 100 passengers, mostly German, 1 American, 9 crew, all French, and 4 people on the ground were killed.
Before this tragic accident that claimed the lives of 109 passengers and crew on board and 4 people on the ground, Concorde was arguably the safest airplane in the world, with 0 passenger deaths by kilometers traveled. Within hours after the accident, the Concorde was temporarily grounded and an intensive investigation commenced. It was later determined that debris that fell off another aircraft onto the runway punctured one of the Concorde's tires during takeoff, causing it to explode, with the projectile rubber penetrating the fuel tank, causing a fire. In addition, unbalanced weight distribution in the fuel tanks, a loose landing gear, and the pilots veering off course on the runway, which reduced takeoff speed below the crucial minimums, were all links in a chain of events that led to the crash. While the Concorde was grounded, both airlines were committed to safety improvements to correct the vulnerability that led to the Paris crash. Each of the Concordes were upgraded with more secure electronic controls, Kevlar lining on the fuel tanks, and the development of special burst-resistant tires. In addition, during the grounding period, British Airways was committed to making Concorde a long-term success and upgraded the whole Concorde experience with new interiors designed by Sir Terence Conran and the London-based firm Factory Design. With this new design campaign, every detail was given a makeover, such as the addition of super light, inky blue cradle seats in Conley hide, bright lights that ripple through the cabin when the aircraft broke the sound barrier, more modern cuisine, cashmere-covered pillows, and spa-like bathrooms. Let's take a quick listen to a clip from a promotional film when this new campaign was unveiled in the fall of 2001.
Concorde is a time machine. It is the only mode of travel where you can arrive before you've actually departed.
The ultimate design icon of the 20th century.
The brief was a sort of dream brief, really.
We have to try and reflect that style, that elegance, that modernity inside the plane.
Bring the elegance of the outside in.
Yeah. It was just look at all aspects of the Concorde experience.
There are specialist designers doing the seats.
Beautiful, beautiful design seats.
It's a carbon fibre bucket seat, which is one complete component.
That is significantly lighter than the existing seat.
It's 20% lighter.
And yet it has many more features.
And the money we save through the fuel saving pays for the project.
The seat that we've designed is absolutely as comfortable as it's possible to make a seat.
Because Concorde is a long-haul flight on short-haul timescales.
We're responsible for the whole interior appearance.
Bringing in the very best that we can, the best leather.
The china and glass, the knives.
And they're actually quite lovely things to hold, and they're a lot lighter than the current cutlery. All of these products here we've designed will be special and unique for Concorde.
Completely new bathrooms, galleys, a new service routine.
With the bathroom,
every little bit of space matters.
And we simplified everything out. We took out the aircraftness.
Have a less is more philosophy.
So that the appearance of the new loo is absolutely as minimal as possible. We wanted to celebrate boarding Concorde. The sides of the pier as you walk towards the plane are clear.
So it's all about the whole theatre of flying on the plane.
We wanted to engage the passengers.
When Concorde goes through the sound barrier, there'll be a lighting effect.
A blue wave of light that washes from the front of the cabin to the back of the cabin in just under a second. Very simple, but quite dramatic.
Certainly the markings of rebirth and a bright new future for the British Airways Concorde program. On November 7th, 2001, normal commercial operations resumed and the Concorde was once again airborne. However, in less than 2 short years, the retirement of the program was announced on April 10th, 2003. Air France was never able to recover financially from the crash and cited low passenger numbers and a decline in overall air travel following the September 11, 2001 attacks. For commercial reasons, the airline decided it would not continue flying Concordes. With Air France out, British Airways was not in a position to absorb 100% of the high maintenance costs of the program. In addition, Airbus had also made the decision to no longer supply custom replacement parts for the British Airways fleet of Concordes. With the loss of their partner of 27 years and the need to find a new supplier to make replacement parts for an aging aircraft first conceived in the early 1960s, British Airways was forced to reluctantly retire the program. Air France made its final Concorde flight on May 30th, 2003, from New York to Paris. In the fall of 2003, British Airways arranged for a grand farewell tour of the aircraft in Toronto, Boston, Washington, D.C., New York, Birmingham, Belfast, Manchester, Cardiff, and Edinburgh. The day before the final flight, Queen Elizabeth II illuminated Windsor Castle, an honor usually reserved for state events and visiting dignitaries, to honor Concorde as the last westbound commercial flight departed for New York overhead. The next day, British Airways made its final Concorde flight on October 24, 2003, from New York to London. Great celebrations were held to bid farewell to this extraordinary aircraft in both New York and London. At the end of this program, we will play the final air traffic control radio recording of JFK bidding Speedbird Concorde a fond and final farewell. Let's listen to a farewell tribute to Concorde produced by British Airways, celebrating 27 supersonic years, and then on to our interviews.
There at the end of the runway is Concorde 001 and in Toulouse, let's join Raymond Baxter.
Just seconds to go.
Et maintenant, enfin, le premier vol.
110 tons of aircraft, all up weight there. The magic moment with us. The crescendo of sound from the 593 Olympus. Giro.
Ce premier vol que vous tous allez voir maintenant en direct.
45 knots, 90, 135. Nose come up to 20 degrees, she's airborne. She flies.
The Concorde was special. The quality of the work, the minds, the skill, the talent, the commitment that went into it, that's what really matters.
Over the last 27 years, Concorde has captured the imagination of people from all over the world. An extraordinary feat of engineering, a unique blend of power, grace, and beauty.
First time I've ever been in the air. Never dreamt of going in it because I'm retired.
I am thrilled. Every single cell in my body is thrilled.
Words fail me. It's so incredible. It's a wonderful experience.
What are you going to tell your school friends when you get back to school on Monday?
Well, trying to find some way of getting them to believe me.
Good morning, sir. Good morning. Welcome aboard.
Welcome to Concorde and our supersonic operation from London's Heathrow to New York's John F. Kennedy. Here we are, ladies and gentlemen. We're through Mark 1, the speed of sound, no bumps, no bangs, Concorde.
There's the view of New York from the Triborough Bridge, there's the Sydney Opera House, and there's Concorde, arguably the three most beautiful man-made sights in the world.
We have carried the Queen Mother, world leaders, stars. It has been an amazing magnet.
Phil Collins had dashed from the Wembley stage to Philadelphia by helicopter and Concorde.
It's good fun. I mean, only a fool such as I would do this.
For 27 years, British Airways Concorde has been a national symbol, a natural centerpiece for celebration.
A few hundred feet over the heads of 1 million people, maybe more, Concorde and the Red Arrows fill the sky.
We flew down the Mall and you could see Her Majesty standing on the balcony. I've never seen 1 million people before, let alone them all looking up and waving and cheering for Concorde.
She's brought cities together, brought people closer, and reminded us all that we can do extraordinary things.
You kind of think, oh, I wonder who might be on Concorde, maybe a famous film star who's just signed a contract in New York or something.
Catherine Zeta-Jones is an absolute star, so glamorous, so Hollywood. Paul McCartney's probably everyone's favourite. He will say hello and he remembers us. Oh, Richard Gere. I've loved him since I was about 5.
You can always recognise it, and it looks like a swan. You know, when swans fly, it looks like a swan with the shape of its neck.
It's the most brilliant example of far-sighted designers, thought ahead and kept to lead for half a century.
No matter how many times you fly, there still is that amazing, exciting sensation when you take off.
Every day is a thrill. By the time the passengers come on board, the air is absolutely charged with excitement.
Speedboat Concorde 1, you're clear for takeoff. 27 left, surface wind 240 at 10. Speedboat Concorde 1, roger, clear for takeoff. 27 left.
It's a thrill. It's the nearest thing I'll ever feel to a rocket.
Power starts to bite, push back into your seat.
Gear speed's building.
You're concentrating like mad.
60 knots.
The noise takes over.
100 knots. That's it.
Heart starts to pound a bit.
V1. Rotate. V2. Positive climb.
For 27 years, she has been our flagship, and her inspiration will stay with us as we take our standards of service still higher and higher.
Captain Mike Bannister joined BOAC, British Airways' predecessor, in 1969 as a pilot and flight navigator on the Vickers VC-10 fleet. He joined the Concorde flight crew in 1977, becoming the fleet's youngest pilot. In 1995, he became chief pilot of British Airways Concorde fleet until the retirement of the aircraft in 2003. Captain Bannister accumulated around 9,600 Concorde flight hours, with almost 7,000 of which were supersonic. Jennifer Coots-Clay first joined us in episode 5 of the Pan Am podcast, titled Missiles, Hotels, and Rebranding an Icon. She began her aviation career at British Airways, where she earned broad experience in marketing and operational management assignments across the airline network. In 1979, she was appointed head of operations and sales for Western USA, the first woman to be appointed to such a position in the airline. From 1984 to 1986, she was responsible for the implementation of the Landor Associates design scheme for the British Airways Concorde fleet, both the exterior livery and the cabin interior treatment of the aircraft. Jennifer joined Pan Am in 1986 as General Manager for Product Design and Development. In this capacity, she completed a 3-year, $25 million fleet upgrade program, redesigning all major aspects of the Pan Am passenger service product. Jennifer is the author of the ebook Jetliner Cabins. You can find a link in the episode description to purchase this book. For over 27 years, John Lampl promoted British Airways Concorde from its first commercial flight in 1976 to its last commercial flight in 2003. John worked on all of the publicity surrounding Concorde, as well as media relations, press conferences, one-on-one interviews, public relations planning, creating crisis communication procedures and manuals, and conducted media training for airline staff. He worked for British Airways for 41 years, and his last position before retiring was as Vice President Corporate Communications in the Americas. Welcome to the Pan Am podcast, Captain Bannister, John, and Jennifer. Captain Bannister, I'd like to start with you. Tell us about what inspired you to become a pilot and how you became a Concorde captain.
Hi, well, I always wanted to be a pilot right from the age of 7. It was kind of those things that I just wanted to do. I was a little lad sitting on the beach in the south of England, watching aircraft flying over, and our coach journey to get there had taken 5.5 hours. And with the precociousness of a 7-year-old, I worked out that the same journey in an airplane would take 20 minutes. So that was it. I was sold. So I told Mum and Dad that's what I wanted to do, and they said, yes, dear. Through school and straight from school to pilot training college, and straight from pilot training college to BOAC, a forerunner of British Airways. But it was when I was studying for my final exams that the British assembled Concorde first took to the air. I can remember I was sitting in a study room watching a little black and white television and watching the commentary as Concorde lifted off from Bristol Filton and flew a very short distance to the test centre at Fairford. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I want to fly Concorde. And of course, I was about 19 years old at the time. With the precociousness of a 19-year-old, I just thought that's what would happen. And luckily for me, a few years later, in 1977, my opportunity came. So I flew Concorde from 77 to 89 as a co-pilot, then joined the British Airways management team before being invited back as the chief pilot in 1995. So I was very lucky. I got 2 bites of the cherry, and it is the most sensational airplane to fly, so I was extremely fortunate.
Well, let's talk about this incredible aircraft, a masterpiece of engineering, innovation, and design, inspired people to dream, modern technological triumph that borders on science fiction. The Americans had the moon landing, and the British and the French had the Concorde. Tell us about why this aircraft is so unique and exceptional?
I guess there's a number of reasons. Clearly, the first one is that it travels very quickly, twice the speed of sound, 1,350 miles an hour, about the speed of an ordinary rifle bullet, a mile every 2.5 seconds, 23 miles a minute, literally faster than the Earth rotates. So you could take off from London in the autumn or in the spring in pitch darkness, and you travel west towards the States so quickly that the sun rises in the west. 3 hours and 20 minutes was a fairly regular flight time between London and New York. The New York-London record is a mere 2 hours and 52 minutes and 59 seconds. So that's the first thing, I guess. The second thing is it was remarkably good comfort, service, cuisine, wine, real top-notch, first class plus, thanks to our fantastic cabin crew that really looked after our customers. And the customers were regular folks. It was a business person's airplane. 80% of the people that traveled Concorde were business people. 80% of those were repeat customers. The remaining 20% were 10% the rich and famous, 5% sports and entertainment, and 5% of folks just doing the trip of a lifetime. So it was, in that sense, sensational. It appealed to everybody. Everybody knew that it was technically wonderful, but it appeals to both sides of the brain because it's also artistically beautiful. And that was at a time when building aircraft was still not as sophisticated and as advanced as it is now. There was no computer-aided design. It was a room full of draftsmen working at their tables and designing it by slide rule. It was originally designed in the 50s, brought to fruition in the 60s, and flew in the 70s. And it had so many first ofs. It was the first fly-by-wire airliner. It was the first aircraft to use fuel to alter the center of gravity to trim the airplane and reduce fuel consumption. It had carbon fiber brakes. It had electrical signaling for the throttles, electrical signaling for the steering, a whole bunch of innovative things that you can find these days on modern aircraft all over the world. So it really was a trailblazer and an absolute delight. And of course, wonderful for the customers who could do in 2 days what would otherwise take 4. Like London to New York, do a couple of days business and back again in 2 days, as opposed to 4 to 5 days. And you felt a lot better. So it ticks so many boxes in terms of being a wonderful tool for the business person, the rich and famous, and for Joe Public, who could save up and for not very much money get that trip of a lifetime.
Jennifer, would you like to speak to the uniqueness of the aircraft and your work on this project?
Well, this is one of my favorite subjects. So thank you very much, Tom, for inviting me to join this podcast today. Yes, the Concorde interior was very special. For a start, it was constrained, and the seating 2+2 on each side of the aisle, 16-inch wide aisle. Many people had to turn sideways to walk down the aisle, but it was a wonderful experience. And in fact, people said that they were very, very comfortable because a lot of work had gone into making the seating very, very accommodating. Now, the different schemes that flew between 1976 and 2003 varied. The first scheme was brown-coloured and looked welcoming and comfortable. The thinking there was that new passengers might be a bit worried about flying at twice the speed of sound, twice the height of Mount Everest, faster than a rifle bullet. And they needed to have seats that looked comfortable, a bit like being in the lobby of a respectable bank or in the reading room of a traditional London club. So the choice at British Airways was to have a brown-coloured fabric with transverse stripes to give a trompe-l'oeil optical illusion impression of greater width across the fuselage. Then in 84, December the 4th, 1984, the Landor Associates scheme was launched and was implemented in 85. And that was a high-tech look because Concorde had become ultra famous worldwide, a symbol of high-tech supremacy and brilliance. So British Airways made the decision to move to a silver pearl grey, they called it, pearl grey scheme. And this was a great jump. The house colour of British Airways, of course, is traditionally blue with red accents, but Concorde was seen as a halo and something different. So the Concorde interior had to look very special. And the grey scheme, the silver grey high-tech scheme, flew with modifications, interim modifications, for about 15 years, which is about twice as long as a normal interior scheme, and was copied by airlines worldwide. For example, when the Canada Regional Jet was introduced into the United States by United Express, the design brief was to make that 50-seater cabin look like one of the Concorde cabins. And when JetBlue launched in New York City, year 2000, even the Wall Street Journal remarked, ooh, they have grey leather-covered seats from nose to tail. And those are just two examples, but there were hundreds of examples of the silver grey high-tech interior inside aircraft on airlines worldwide. And then launched in 2001, although the design work had started in the late 90s, a very different scheme was implemented, very opulent, but not extravagant, a deep blue, a midnight blue, ink blue, dark blue leather scheme. And that was headed by Sir Terence Conran, Factory Design, and Britax Aviation. And those seats were beautifully upholstered. We're talking about seats that were only 17 inches wide, but ultra comfortable. And so we found that with Concorde customers, they were very happy with their seats. And the seat pitch was 37 or 38 inches, a bit like premium economy these days. So yes, the interior history of Concorde deserves a book in its own right, I would say.
John, as head of airline communications for British Airways for the Concorde project, for all of its operational history, I'm sure you have lots of stories to tell. Would you like to share any of those?
You know, it's looking back over the years. It was really a team effort from the communications point of view. I was lucky enough to be in New York and be on the sort of stateside part of it, but had been to London many times. It, as Mike said, and I'd like to reiterate, it was the speed factor. The people that I dealt with in public relations, the news media, radio, television, broadcast, newspaper, social platforms didn't really exist at the time. But at any rate, everybody was so impressed about the speed. To go one further, what Mike had said, I mean, literally a business person or a journalist covering a story could leave London at 10 in the morning, get into New York at 9:30, do business, cover whatever news story they had, and take the 1 o'clock aircraft back to London and be home for a late dinner that evening. It was just incredible. I think a lot of the news media that I dealt with were terribly impressed, one, with the speed, but as both Jennifer and Mike have said, you know, the people that traveled on Concorde, you know, you'd be sitting next to, I flew once with Margaret Thatcher. I was on a plane with Eric Clapton and all these famous superstars who you sort of dreamt about or saw on television or heard on the radio. You know, they were there, and it was so real. It's quite incredible. I was very lucky at one time to go on an inaugural flight when we did a joint service with Singapore Airlines. And at one time we did a flight, it went from London at a fuel stop in Bahrain, and then on to Singapore. And that was amazing. You could be in the morning in London and in the evening in Singapore. Normally it's a long flight on a subsonic airplane. But to do that on Concorde was thrilling beyond anybody's wild imagination. As Mike had said, and as Jennifer has said, it was probably the most photographed airplane ever. It probably still is. The lines, the curves, it's a thing of beauty. And really that's what everybody was impressed about, that and then the really sad part, there's no successor other than there are a couple companies now that are trying to build or design a successor to Concorde, to supersonic flight. But I don't think in our lifetime anybody will see such a successful airplane as Concorde. I'm forever grateful that I had the experience to fly on this airplane.
Captain Bannister, many of our listeners work in the aviation industry and are pilots. Can you walk us through what it was like to fly this aircraft?
I guess the most impressive thing was that despite all its sophistication and advanced technology and the speed and its performance, you could actually fly the airplane with your fingertips all the way through takeoff, climb out, climb to subsonic altitude, acceleration through the sound barrier, all the way up to 60,000 feet, across the Atlantic, deceleration, descent, and onto landing. You could do it all with your fingertips. I have done that. It was so responsive. It was a real pilot's airplane. Not a complicated airplane, a complex airplane. There's a huge amount for the crew to learn and understand, because it's four airplanes in one. It's a high airplane, a low airplane, a fast airplane, and a slow airplane. Because, of course, for the takeoff and landing phase, you're in amongst the same traffic as all the other aircraft. You've got to mix in with them. You've got to fly at the same speeds. You've got to be able to do what they can do and then go on to do things they can only dream of doing. So it was a delight for flying, very satisfying, because not just the speed. One of the other things that we as operating crew were really keen on was punctuality. There's not a huge amount of point in crossing the Atlantic in 3 hours and 20 minutes if you set off an hour late. So the whole airline was really focused, as it is now, on punctuality. But with Concorde in particular, punctuality was essential. And it was very, very unusual for us to leave late and very unusual to arrive late. And even to this day, when I talk to people about Concorde, it's very common to hear folks say, yes, I used to set my clock because Concorde came over my school or my office or my home at 11 o'clock every morning. It was that regular. And of course, such a distinctive, to my ears, beautiful sound. On the loud side, perhaps, but distinctive. And we got very few sound complaints, despite the fact that it was fundamentally quite a noisy airplane. So it was a delightful airplane to operate. It kept you busy. There wasn't much time to sit down and read the paper, but it kept you busy, but it was demanding, and because of that, very satisfying to operate it efficiently, effectively, and punctually across the Atlantic.
So, Captain Bannister, when you were walking through the terminal and when children were on your aircraft, how did that make you feel that they looked at you as a role model?
Well, that's an interesting thought. I never really thought of it like that. I was just fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time and to be honored and privileged to fly this beautiful airplane and to work with a sensational group of people within British Airways and all of our associate partners that made this happen. So it certainly wasn't something I felt I was a role model about. I was very, very grateful to be part of a bigger team that pulled together. At the time, at any given moment within British Airways, there were about 250 people within the Concorde team. And that was at a time when the airline employed 41,000 people. Not always the same 250 throughout the life of the airplane, but flight crew, cabin crew, ground staff, loaders, baggage loaders, ticket sales agents, John and his colleagues in the press office, Jennifer and the folks looking after the internal design. All of that group made up at about 250 people. So you knew most of them, quite a lot of them by name, and the ones that you work more often with, you know their families. So it was a family atmosphere inside a massive airline. And that in itself was remarkably rewarding. So walking through the terminal, I wasn't really thinking about being a role model, but just how lucky that 7-year-old boy had become.
In 1963, Pan American World Airways placed an order for Concorde for 6, and then added 2 later in the 60s. In 1973, Pan Am and TWA canceled their orders 3 hours apart. Jennifer, I understand that you have a Pan Am story when you joined Pan Am in the mid-'80s.
Yes, I joined Pan Am in August 1986, and it was really interesting. Shortly after my arrival at the Pan Am building here in Midtown Manhattan, there was a meeting in the boardroom on the 46th floor to deal with the presentation material relating to the Airbus A310-300, for which Pan Am was the launch customer. Very exciting time because Pan Am was going to be flying 2 engines on the Atlantic, the twin engine operations. And this was going to be less expensive than 3 engines, like the Lockheed 1011, or 4 engines like the Boeing 747. So I got to the boardroom early because I had to bring some files from the design department. And when I walked through the door, I was quite amazed because there on the table was a model Concorde in full Pan Am livery with a blue ball on the tail. And I just stopped in my tracks. I was amazed. And I thought, oh, maybe something special is going to happen. Oh, what is this? So I was told that among the model aircraft, and Pan Am had a wonderful collection of model aircraft, they always loved showing off Concorde in Pan Am livery, and they wished they had had Concorde. And oh, it would have been so different if they had had Concorde. Of course, these comments came from the marketing people who had wonderful dreams and speculations. But that experience really brought it home to me, how special Concorde was. And as with John and as with Captain Bannister, I feel that I was greatly privileged to have the chance to work on Concorde while I was at British Airways. And again, Concorde set style standards because the design development plans in those days, in the late 80s, really tried to feature a high-tech look instead of the more comfortable appearance that had been the style back in the 70s. So Concorde's legacy lives on in different ways.
John, would you like to talk about the market segments and the different routes between British Airways and Air France?
Well, of course, British Airways flew between New York, JFK, and London Heathrow. And that's still probably the most heavily traveled route in the world, I guess, today. It's certainly one of the most, more passengers fly between London and New York than probably any other route on the Atlantic. And that was the bread and butter route. We did, through the years, and Mike knows probably a lot more of the destinations than I do, but we also did, early on, we did this, when it first started, we had to fly London to Bahrain because the United States government would not permit Concorde to fly to the United States. But when we did in 1976, we flew first to Dulles Airport at Washington, and then a year and a half later, well, it started in May of 76, and then in November of 77, we got the rights to fly into JFK. And from then on, we operated twice daily between New York and London. And in the beginning, it was several times a week between Washington and London. We also flew for a while between Washington and Miami, sort of a subsonic, go out of the water maybe for 15, 20 minutes, supersonic, and then come to Miami. And I think that ran for a short period of time. We did a lot of charter work to various cities in the United States and around the world. We also flew on weekends. We would fly from Heathrow to the Caribbean, I think to Barbados. And from New York, we had a few charter flights to Bermuda. But in the end, certainly the London-Barbados flight was very successful. It flew once a week, I believe, on Saturdays. And that was always full. And I can remember people telling us all about that. And as I previously said, we did have this arrangement at one time with Singapore Airlines, flying from London to Singapore via Bahrain. And that worked very well until Singapore decided that from a commercial point of view, they wanted to split off and fly their own route. They never did order Concorde, as far as I know, but it was too much of a competition that cut into their premium business. So we stopped that service. But the charter work that we did with Concorde was amazing. I mean, we probably flew, and Mike can confirm that we probably flew to every country in the world, and so many cities in the United States. I remember being on the ground at Seattle, Washington, and at Las Vegas, Nevada. When it flew from JFK to some of the cities in the United States, we had to fly subsonically because of the overfly rules, but we flew just under the sound barrier so we wouldn't boom everybody below us. But people in the United States were thrilled to have Concorde come to their local airports. So, and of course, it was great news. I remember once a dual landing at Orlando, where the two aircraft landed on parallel runways at Orlando for a big, I think it was some sort of Disney promotion or something like that. The French started at the same time. They flew to one of the islands just off of Africa and then on to Rio de Janeiro. I think it was Brazil. And Mike, correct me if I'm off the mark here, but of course their bread and butter route was Paris, Charles de Gaulle to JFK, and that they did successfully. Although more people, we were able to do double daily because more people just flew between London and New York. There was more of a demand, and we were able to provide that service.
Yeah, and if I could add a bit to what John was saying there, it's quite amazing that when Concorde first came in, we had a limited scheduled destinations, the ones that John had mentioned, and also Dallas, Fort Worth. But what was really interesting were the number of charter or special flights that we did. Concorde actually went to 252 different airports around the world. 76 of those were in the USA. And many of those were a one-off visit. I can remember going to Oklahoma City once. 45,000 people turned out to see the aircraft. And you don't get that around the world for any other airplane at all. 45,000 people living in the Oklahoma area came out that day just to see this wonderful airplane. And it's when that sort of thing happens that it just underscores what you already know, just how fortunate the three of us were to be involved with the Concorde program.
May I add something about the Air France route from Paris to Rio de Janeiro? It flew into Dakar, Senegal. And I remember being in Dakar, Senegal, and this was a long time after Concorde had ceased operations, but there was a big sign near the runway saying, "Welcome to Concorde." And I know from people who did fly that route, they could walk in the Bois de Boulogne in the morning, take Concorde, and apparently they could swim on Copacabana Beach later that afternoon. But the really wonderful experience, apparently, was at Dakar, because they didn't have environmental restrictions there at the time. And apparently Concorde could hurtle down the runway and take off like a jet fighter going up vertically, they used to say, like a rocket. And this was terribly exciting. So I wanted to add that because many customers reported that wonderful experience. And now I wonder whether they've still got that sign at the airport at Dakar, "Welcome to Concorde." I know they would love to have Concorde back in their airport all over again.
Just to add to that little vignette, I remember once traveling, I think it was out of Barbados or Bermuda, but when we took off, sort of taking off and then flying over the Atlantic, you could achieve the speed of sound much quicker than you could, let's say, taking off at London or at New York, because around those cityfied airports, you'd have to use various. You'd have to throttle back for the noise, for the environment, and not to produce so much noise around the airport. But on the islands, you could just leave the afterburners on and just get to supersonic much quicker than you could departing from the traditional airports.
So when I was a boy in the 1980s, my dad took me to the Cleveland Air Show, and the Concorde was there, and it was still one of those boyhood moments that you'll never forget. Perhaps you were there, Captain Bannister. Cleveland, Ohio.
Funny you should say that. I was actually flying it, because that was the last time that we used Concorde in a real air show, really putting her through her paces. It had been something that we'd done for a number of years, but as health and safety became more predominant and the British Airways board became more conservative, and we decided that really this aircraft was fundamentally a passenger carrying tool and not an air show display beast, the powers that be reined in the number of displays that we could do. And the one in Cleveland, Ohio was the very last one that we did in the USA, and I was actually flying it that day. So yes, I do remember it very well. And it was huge fun. We really racked the airplane around like a fighter. The minimum height we would go down to is 200 feet, 60 degrees of bank, which is almost 3 times as much as you get in a conventional airplane. And we would pull up to 2G, twice the weight of gravity, and minus 1G. So, and we had a particular air show routine that we would do, which we had perfected over the years. So it was a great boys' day out to go and throw this aircraft around. And it was a great shame from a pilot's perspective when we stopped doing that. But of course, I did fully understand that really this is a tool for the customer and not a toy for the pilots. But nonetheless, it was great fun.
That's so cool that you were flying that. And I was, 36 years ago, I was a 6-year-old boy. That's really, really cool. I will tell you, as I was in the audience watching that, they were cheering when the Concorde started doing those maneuvers. It was one of those experiences that you'll never forget.
It's quite funny. We did something very similar before that. As I say, that was the last time we did in the USA. We did something similar at the Canadian International Air Show at Toronto, out over the lake. And we would go down to 200 feet and high angles of bank and strong G. And the following day, we got a terrible rocket off to the air show organizers because the wind was in a particular direction, and we'd got down to 200 feet and pulling 6G, and the big 2G, the big vortices off the wing had grabbed the water and created a 6-foot wave which had swept across the lake, flooding the air traffic control caravan. And so that the whole air show came to a halt for 15 minutes while they made alternative arrangements, I guess just because we were showing off. So yeah, it was really great fun, a fabulous thing to fly.
So John, would you like to speak to the charter flights and special flights? I've heard about day trips from London to Cairo to see the pyramids and then be back home by dinner.
Well, I think, first of all, if you're going to go to Egypt, I wouldn't do it in one day. I would spend at least a week there seeing the pyramids and all the beautiful temples and the great magnificent objects that Egypt has to offer. But yes, I mean, you have to fly subsonic over Europe and then land in Cairo. And probably Mike will know much better than I, correct me, probably a 2 or 3 hour flight. Because subsonically, I think it's 4 or 5 hours, I don't know. But that would have been a fabulous thing, fly to Concorde in the morning, do a tour of the pyramids and fly back to London that evening. I never did experience that. I knew we probably had flights like that, but the charters, as Mike said, the charters did attract people. It was incredible. I remember when I was talking about that dual landing at Orlando, thousands and thousands of people came out to the airport to view that. I remember the airport in Los Angeles where people came out, or other places. I remember being in Seattle once in November when the Beaujolais Nouveau was released in France. And there was a British Airways Concorde that flew a huge load of Beaujolais Nouveau wine to be distributed in the Pacific Northwest. And it was amazing that what the airplane could do and the people that it would attract. And it's still a people grabber.
Air Force One is a symbol of the United States government. Pan Am is a symbol of America when it was in business. And Concorde is really a symbol of the United Kingdom.
And France.
Captain Bannister, can you tell us a little bit about some of the celebrations you've been involved with, including performances of the aircraft in front of the Queen?
Of course, Concorde was a huge publicity tool for British Airways, as well as being a wonderful passenger-carrying airplane, and we used her as such. So quite a lot of the charters and the special flights we've been talking about were actually designed and scheduled to fit in around major events. So, for instance, taking the US golf team to and from the Ryder Cup when the Ryder Cup's played in Europe, or across for the Open, the British Open. Major sporting events like Wimbledon, major cup finals and soccer matches and matches in the USA, we would arrange for Concorde to do a special charter flight that happened to take us over those sporting venues at the time, hopefully when the whole thing was coming towards an end. So just by the time of the final whistle or the final bell, lo and behold, a Concorde would come over the top. And we didn't have to say anything. The TV cameras would always follow it because it's such a beautiful airplane. We in British Airways didn't have to do or say anything because that shape said British Airways. And so it was wonderful free advertising for us. And we also used it for major state occasions. So I've been fortunate enough to fly with the UK Air Force aerobatic team, the Red Arrows, on a number of occasions. The state opening of the Scottish Parliament and the anniversary of Heathrow. But the most memorable one for me was for Her Majesty the Queen's Golden Jubilee. Platinum Jubilee is coming up this year. So this was her Golden Jubilee. So it's 20 years ago this year. And we formated with the Red Arrows and lots of other RAF airplanes. But we brought up the end of the display and we flew down the Mall, the long, gorgeous avenue leading up to Buckingham Palace. We flew down the Mall at 1,000 feet at 325 miles an hour. 10 aircraft in close formation with Concorde leading the 9 Red Arrows. And I kind of knew what that was like because I'd done that formation flying before. What I didn't know and what I couldn't even possibly perceive in advance was what it was like to look at 1.5 million people. There were 1.5 million people in and around the palace, in the parks, on the bridges, down the Mall, and they were literally shoulder to shoulder, waving and cheering. And from 1,000 feet, which is just over 300 yards, you could see individual faces, you could see umbrellas and flags. And when we came over Admiralty Arch, which is at the end of the Mall, looking down the Mall, you could see Her Majesty standing on the balcony at Buckingham Palace, and she was wearing a flame orange outfit, so distinctive. And that's just one of those things that sticks in my mind and will stick in my mind forever. And it was a really sensational and exciting thing to do. And then just to crown it all, because I was lucky enough to do that, I was subsequently invited to a reception held by Her Majesty at the palace to thank all those that were involved in the Golden Jubilee. So I actually got to meet her and chatted for about 4 or 5 minutes, and also spoke to His Royal Highness Prince Philip. And we were talking about Concorde in general and how she used to come over Windsor Castle when the wind was in a particular direction. And he would always say that, yes, he knew full well about that because that's what kept him awake at night, which actually wasn't true because we didn't fly at those sort of times, but it was his little joke. He was a huge enthusiast for Concorde, and he has actually flown it because he was a very accomplished pilot. So on the early days, he went up on a test flight and did actually fly the airplane. But yes, we used it as a PR tool, and we were very, very fortunate to be involved in many special events like that.
Tom, if I could add, carrying on what Mike said about sporting events, I'm a tennis enthusiast and have attended Wimbledon, and I'll never forget. One day I was in center court, and the aircraft flew over as it was on approach to Heathrow, and play just stopped. Everybody looked up, and for, 10, 15 seconds, everybody just gazed in wonder at this gorgeous airplane. It was fabulous. I'll never forget that.
Can I jump in with another item? There's a very famous picture of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, sitting in the flight deck. Now, that was a very special occasion, I think. Captain Bannister, were you involved in that event when the Queen Mother took her place in the flight deck?
I actually pressed the shutter on the camera because I was on the flight deck as the supernumerary pilot. We've got an extra pilot on board, and we'd invited Her Majesty up for the takeoff and the landing, which was a civility that we extended to members of the royal family. Very rarely accepted, but Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, did on both occasions. And she was there. It was her 80th birthday celebrations, and she was absolutely thrilled to be sitting on the flight deck. I've also thrown the Royal Highness, the Princess Margaret, on the flight deck of Concorde, which was a surprise again, because although we extend the courtesy, they rarely accept it. But I can remember coming into Heathrow, flying over Windsor Castle and looking out and seeing the Royal Standard flying, and Royal Highness the Princess Margaret leaning on forward and saying, "Oh, I can see my sister's home." So it was great fun, and you got to meet some very, very interesting people.
What were some of the differences between the British Airways Concorde operation and Air France?
The biggest difference was the style at which the operation was pitched from a customer's perspective. British Airways pitched it at first class plus, Air France pitched it at business class plus. And that difference showed because there were a huge number of customers originating in France, but not from immediately around the Paris area, who would choose to fly wherever they were, say in the south, let's say Marseille, for instance. They wanted to go from Marseille to the States on Concorde. They'd go Marseille to London and get on the British Airways flight rather than Marseille to Paris and get on the Air France flight, because our onboard offering was superior. In terms of operating, we had a bigger operating program. As John mentioned already, we were operating 2 flights a day in each direction to New York. Air France were only operating 1. We had a broader route structure, and the airplanes themselves were effectively identical. In the very early days, there were plans about having interchangeability, that British Airways and Air France could fly each other's aircraft. That never actually came to pass. But from a technical perspective, they were very, very similar. But from a customer perspective, we definitely in British Airways endeavored to make it a first-class plus project. And that's part of the reason why we spent so much time, effort, and energy with wonderful people like Jennifer, making sure that what we were offering on board was the best in the air. And when she mentioned early on that other airlines and manufacturers copied what we'd done, that is the greatest praise. greatest praise you can possibly have is when somebody's copying what you've come up with. So, it was huge fun to just see the look on customers' faces when they get off, having traveled for just 3 hours and 20 minutes, crossed the Atlantic. They've gained an hour and 40 minutes of their life because they've arrived before they've left. They're feeling great because they traveled across the Atlantic in an airplane whose cabin altitude's equivalent to 5,000 feet rather than 8,000 feet. And they all had a smile, every single one of them. So, yeah, it was huge fun.
Can I say one thing? Mike just touched on it. The feeling that one had getting off the aircraft because you had flown across the Atlantic at 5,000 feet rather than 8,000 feet, which is common among the subsonics. So whether it was jet lag or your stiffness or whatever, Concorde was a healthier airplane in that respect.
Yes, I would like to jump in. People came off Concorde beaming and smiling, and quite often going straight off to parties or business meetings. How often did we ever hear of Concorde passengers saying they felt tired or unwell or snoozy after the flight? Somehow the flight gave them great energy, and that's something really memorable. So I think that was one of Concorde's great achievements.
There was another factor in it as well. As John mentioned, not only were you at 5,000 feet, of course, for just over 3 hours, as opposed to 8,000 feet for 8 hours, the other thing was you were traveling so quickly that the sun apparently went backwards in the sky because you're traveling faster than the Earth rotates. And so that, we're told by the scientists, is part of resetting the body clock. So because it's a subconscious thing, you don't think about it, but because the sun is going backwards in the sky, it resets the body clock. And when you took off from London at 11 a.m. and arrived in New York at 20 past 9 a.m., gaining an hour and 40 minutes, it actually really felt like 20 past 9 in the morning. So you really did have the opportunity to do a full day's work or a full day's pleasure, whatever you chose to do, and you felt fresh and fit and capable of doing it.
We haven't talked about one subject, a very important subject. We alluded to it, but let's talk about the food on Concorde.
Well, I would like to offer some comments. The food on Concorde was superlative and at the very highest standard. And in fact, Air France started the celebrity status for Concorde food and beverage and menu design and service standards. In particular, it was Alain Ducasse, the wonderful chef based at Hôtel de Paris in Monaco, with more Michelin stars than any other chef at the time, apparently. And Air France regarded Concorde as a display platform for French cuisine, French wines, French service standards. And the cabin crew members actually went along to the Alain Ducasse kitchens for special training. And the menus were really wonderful. We're talking about lobster tail, we're talking about foie gras, we're talking about quenelle, we're talking about delicacies, truffles. And this was really one of their main selling points. On British Airways, we were very fortunate because the food and beverage programs were headed by the Roux brothers and Anton Mosiman, who was the head of the Dorchester food and beverage programs. And the galleys on Concorde are tiny. How the cabin crew managed to serve these wonderful meals with the constraints of the galleys, well, that's quite a miracle. But the food was renowned and very, very carefully structured. So the menus were ultra luxurious. And then there were opportunities to offer very, very special wines and champagnes, vintage marque. So the food and beverage was a very important point given the marketing positioning, product feature and customer benefit. Oh, why should it be so important? People used to ask. Well, in fact, the aim was for passengers to remain in their seats. Concorde's not the sort of aircraft where people can wander around, like the Airbus A380, for example, and sit on a sofa or visit a cocktail bar, as on, let's say, the A340. Virgin Atlantic had a very famous cocktail bar. Concorde has the tiny aisle, 16 inches wide. And so this aircraft seat was extremely important. It had to be comfortable and welcoming, but it was very important for passengers to have something to do during the flight. Did they have seatback TV? No. What sort of entertainment was there? Well, audio entertainment, multi-channel audio programs, and then this amazing meal. And the flight attendants did a brilliant job. On their trays, they could carry up to a dozen glasses of champagne or half a dozen glasses of wine absolutely smoothly, because there isn't turbulence up at the high altitude. And so passengers were able to look out through the window of Concorde. Now, the window pane is about the size of a passport, 6.5 inches high, 4.5 inches wide. And if they were really lucky, they could see the dark blue indigo colour of the distant horizon and possibly curvature of the Earth. But the meal service was the central activity, and it was exotic, it was wonderful, and people still talk about the Concorde menus. So yes, it was a great experience on both Air France and British Airways.
I know it was very bittersweet when the end of the program came in 2003. Would anyone like to talk about why Concorde?
I guess I'll take that if I may. As you might imagine, from a personal perspective, it was very sad. It followed a terrible accident in Paris when Concorde crashed and 113 people were killed. But that was not the reason why British Airways stopped operating Concorde. We were committed to the aircraft, and immediately after that, I was heavily involved in the accident investigation. We were looking at mechanisms to absolutely ensure that that accident could never happen again. And we found those mechanisms. Now, all accidents are a chain of events. There are links in the chain. Even the simplest accident, falling over in the shower, has got 3 links in it. The water's running, you drop the soap, you don't look where you put your foot. An aircraft accident's much more complex. The Concorde one had about 27 links in the chain. If you take any one of the links away, it won't happen. We took away 3 links out of the chain. We put new tires on the aircraft, we put linings in the fuel tanks, and we changed the electrical wiring system. So from a safety perspective, the aircraft was perfectly fine. That accident couldn't happen again. And we got our customers together, and we actually had major events in the UK and in the States where we drew together our top customers, explained exactly what we'd done. And in the UK, they could actually climb inside the airplanes, put their head in the fuel tanks, see what we were doing. So from a perspective of the customer, all they wanted was this wonderful business tool back. And they were delighted when we did return to service in 2001. And we in British Airways, as Jennifer mentioned, had put a brand new interior on the airplane with gorgeous dark blue leather seats. Incidentally, the weight saving from those seats counterbalanced the additional weight of the modification, so that was good news. And we were operating really successfully for a while after that. But the story wasn't the same with Air France. With Air France, of course, it was their accident, and so it had a much, much, much bigger effect on them. They had never positioned their aircraft as being first class plus. They had never moved away from the government subsidy arrangement that we in Britain had until 1984, when we moved away from it. And so the incentive for them to be commercially successful wasn't there. There was a large loss on the Air France books as Air France was coming up for privatization. All of these things came together to persuade Air France that the time had come for them to stop operating. And of course, it was difficult enough operating a really sophisticated airplane where there's two airlines involved. And with only one airline involved, it would have been much more difficult and much, much more expensive. We in British Airways would have almost had to double our cost on engineering infrastructure with the manufacturers. So the numbers just didn't add up. And I can remember our chief exec at the time, Rod Eddington, saying that we all knew that all good stories have an ending. There's always a final chapter. In Concorde's case, it's just come sooner than we would have liked. I argued vehemently within BA that we shouldn't cancel the project. We should carry on, but my argument didn't carry the day. So then you're faced with a choice, aren't you? Do you throw your toys out of the pram and go off in a huff, or do you accept collective responsibility and get on with it? So I chose answer B. And for my sins, I was put in charge of the retirement program. And I was determined, as all of my colleagues were around me, to make sure that the 27 years of successful supersonic service with British Airways on Concorde was a celebration and not a wait. And so in collaboration with John and his colleagues in marketing and communications, we ensured that we really waved the flag around the world, culminating in a really memorable last flight from New York to London on the 24th of October, 2003. And then subsequent to that, of course, we took some of our Concorde fleet to be on display to the public, including those in the United States, in New York and in Seattle. So it was a sad moment, but I put it in context with thinking about the 10th anniversary flight. I flew the 10th anniversary flight out of New York down to Bermuda, as John mentioned earlier, 10 years to the day after Concorde came into service. And the Concorde test pilot, Brian Trubshaw, was on board. Chatting to him, he said, well, it's amazing, Mike. I never thought Concorde would operate for 10 years. It operated for 27 years. So there was a huge amount to celebrate. We were determined to do that, and hopefully we were successful.
You had mentioned that the public can see Concorde aircrafts in various museums. I understand that you're heavily involved with Brooklyn's museum. Can you tell us a little bit about the Concorde display there?
Yeah, I'm involved with Brooklyn's Museum, which is in Weybridge. I'm also involved with the museum in Bristol. Each museum that has a Concorde does it slightly differently to major on particular aspects of the aircraft. In Brooklyn's, where a third of each airplane, be it an Air France one or a British Airways one, was built actually in Brooklyn's. We also have the simulator that I learned to fly on and did my 6 monthly checks on. And now members of the public can come and fly with me or with one of my colleagues and can fly Concorde around, do a takeoff and a landing, and have a lot of fun on the way. We've also got the largest spare holdings of Concorde, and we've also got the model that used to be at the end of the tunnel at Heathrow. And when it was there, it's quite funny, it was referred to as the Concorde roundabout because it dominated. It was a quarter-size model. It dominated the roundabout at the end of the access tunnel at Heathrow. And about 3 years ago, I was giving an after-dinner speech, and I mentioned this. And after the speech, a chap came up to me, and he said he was a taxi driver from London, and he was telling me the story about how many times he'd come out to Heathrow. And he said, Mike, he said, you know that you said about the Concorde model? I said, yeah. He said, well, you know that it's not been there now for almost 15 years. I said, yeah. And he said, you know that there's a model of an A380 there now? Yeah. And he said, do you know how much it cost to have that model put there? I said, well, no, not really. So well, it cost £10 million to rent the site and £15 million for the model itself. So that's £25 million. And he said, and us London cabbies still call it the Concorde roundabout after 15 years. So Concorde made an impression on lots of people. The one at Bristol, of course, was the last Concorde to be made, and also the last Concorde to actually fly when it flew into there on November the 26th, 2003. Each one is done slightly differently. So the Concordes around the world are major attractions at the museums that are fortunate enough to have them on display.
John and Jennifer, would you like to talk about the Intrepid Museum in New York City?
So the Intrepid displays Concorde. As Captain Bannister explained, it's on a platform alongside the deck of the aircraft carrier. And it can be seen from the George Washington Bridge and from the West Side Highway. And people say, "Oh, what's that?" They can also see the Blackbird from the West Side Highway. So Concorde's in very good company. And I was told by Eric Bohm, the curator, the aviation curator, that of all the tours at the Intrepid, and they have apparently between 1 and 2 dozen tours at different times of the year, that along with the space shuttle, Concorde is top of the list for customers. And the tours bring the visitors inside Concorde, and they take a certain number of people. When I was there last, it was about 15 in the group. And the guides have studied the subject very, very carefully. They do an excellent job explaining about the operational capability of Concorde, the fact that it was the supersonic flagship of both Air France and British Airways. But they've got Alpha Delta, an award-winning special Concorde, there at the museum.
As Mike talked about museums, where were we going to put these airplanes? We just didn't want them to go somewhere and just rust and deteriorate. But these airplanes were fabulous artifacts, much like the pyramids are, I guess, in Egypt. But anyway, we wanted the history and the legacy of Concorde to live on as long as possible. And we were looking at various museums flights, particularly where the aircraft flew. There's one airplane in Barbados, for example. And the other obvious one was, let's bring it to New York. And after a lot of negotiation and looking around, you couldn't run one down Fifth Avenue in New York City, but the Intrepid was an ideal location. So we offered it up to them. We worked with them very closely. And I'll never forget, on the day the aircraft came, it was flown from London to JFK, rolled into a hangar, and the engines were, over a period of time, probably, I don't know, it was a week or 2 weeks, the engines were dismantled, a lot of the electrics and other stuff disconnected, to make the aircraft ready to be literally floated up the Long Island Sound under the Verrazano Bridge, and then to its future home at the Intrepid, which is on sort of the west side of Manhattan, near 46th Street and 12th Avenue, next to some of the older cruise piers. It's where the Intrepid is located. And it was an amazing feat. I remember, and I guess it was the middle of the night, the airplane was towed to a point where JFK, one of the runways, I think it's 22 right and 4 left, is adjacent to the water. And it was sort of rolled onto the barge, or craned onto the barge, rather. And then the barge trip out of Long Island Sound to the west under the Verrazano Bridge. And the news coverage we had at the time was unbelievable. We were on the front page of the New York Times. We were probably the first item for any TV broadcast when it came through and up the Hudson. And then it took, I think, a day or two to be craned from the barge onto the pier adjacent to the Intrepid. And it has remained there. It's been sort of, at one time, in the beginning, it was sort of on its tires, but then it was jacked up so the tires wouldn't deteriorate. And there's been a lot of maintenance done on the Concorde. And that's something that we were discussing earlier about the extreme weather situations in the Northeast, in New York in particular. So the airplane has to withstand rain, snow, excessive heat. And so the Intrepid has a very complete and fastidious maintenance program. But it is, the Intrepid people always say that, it's one of the major highlights of the Intrepid Airspace and Sea Museum, and that, thousands and thousands of people that enter the museum always come by and walk under the airplane and look up. And you can book excursions or tours inside the aircraft at specific times, working through the intrepid people. But as Jennifer had mentioned earlier, there are a lot of people that know the inside and outside of the airplane very, very well, and give an excellent description of the tour when you're actually doing it.
Jennifer, are there any special Concorde moments that you would like to mention for our listeners?
One of the developments in the scheme that flew from 2001 onwards, and that was the wash of blue light that flowed through the cabin when Concorde reached Mach 1 speed of sound. I think this was a brilliant brainwave at the time because it's silent. And the idea was that passengers who were snoozing or reading their very important documents or listening to the audio channels might not want to be disturbed by an announcement. And passengers who were not snoozing were wondering what was happening because they were probably looking at the Mach meter and seeing the numbers climbing. And so this was a wonderful brainwave to organize this flow, this wash of blue light flowing through the cabin. I remember in earlier days, there were various debates. Oh, what should happen when Concorde reaches Mach 1? Well, the typical response was, we need an announcement, and the announcement was always very clear and always very helpful. But the blue light was something a bit more spiritual, a bit more artistic. And I think that that was a wonderful way to communicate with passengers. And people still talk about that product feature. So all credit to the team that developed that particular scheme in the late days of the Concorde operation.
I think to carry on that conversation, one of the questions that I used to get asked all the time is that, what's it like to feel? What does it feel like going through the sound barrier? And the answer was nothing. And that was the incredible aspect of being a passenger on Concorde. Yes, you had no conception of how fast you were flying other than the Mach meter on the bulkhead walls. You could see it climbing through Mach 2.8 and then up. Once it got Mach 0.1, you break the sound barrier and you get up to Mach 2. It was incredible, but there was no actual sensation other than the landing and the takeoff of what a comfortable ride this was. But the speed, you didn't know. And people would say, well, does the airplane shudder when it goes through the Concorde, go through the sound barrier, or what happens? And the answer was nothing. You don't know, other than being the receiving end of an announcement, or you're watching the Mach meter on the bulkhead walls. It was such an incredibly comfortable airplane.
And I could add, John, that it was not noisy. People have asked me on occasions, did you all have to shout at each other to speak with each other? And the answer is no. We were able to speak in a normal way. So that's another great triumph.
About going through the sound barrier, it's got in the early days, I bumped into George Edwards, who was the British senior project manager for the entire Concorde program. And he told me a lovely story about when they were doing some early test flying with passengers on board. And these were 100 passengers chosen from all sorts of walks of life just to be passengers on board to try the airplane out before it actually came into service. And on this particular flight, he told me that they had to invite an 85-year-old lady who had never flown. I mean, I don't mean she'd never piloted. She had never been on an airplane. And at the end of the flight, and they'd gone up to Mach 2 and come back and landed back again. At the end of the flight, George Edwards said that he said to her, "Now tell me, madam, did you enjoy your flight?" And she said, "Yes, it was wonderful." She said, "But I was a little bit disappointed." And he said, "What were you disappointed in?" She said, "Well, when we went through the sound barrier, the aircraft didn't vibrate and shake like I expected it to." And George Edwards said, "Madam, that's the clever bit." It took the designers and the engineers so much effort and energy and brain power to enable it to do what it did. And it became so transparent going through the sound barrier. That's why we had to make announcements from the flight deck or put the blue light in, because otherwise the customers just wouldn't know that they were now traveling faster than the speed of sound.
There's one funny story that I never knew if it was true or not, but it was particularly poignant for Concorde, in that the Pope flew once from London to New York, and he got to JFK and came off the aircraft, but wanted to come down the stairs, not go through the terminal jetway. And he descended the stairs and kissed the ground and said, somebody asked him, what a wonderful flight this was. And they asked him, well, what was so unique about it? What was it? It was, it's the closest I've ever been to head office. And that in itself, spoke to the fantastic capabilities of what Concorde could do.
All right, one last question for the group. Concorde has earned an important and prestigious place in history and was a groundbreaking achievement. What do you think about that? And looking back on your time with the program, how does that make you feel? Captain Bannister, let's start with you.
I think, first of all, very honored and privileged to be part of such a wonderful story, especially for the 7-year-old boy who always wanted to be a pilot. And the gee whizness of the airplane. Here's this aircraft that could travel on the edge of space where the sky got darker, where you could see the curvature of the Earth. 23 miles a minute, a mile every 2 3/4 seconds. You're traveling so quickly that you're arriving in New York an hour and 40 minutes before you leave London. You're traveling so high that you can see the curvature of the Earth. You're going faster than the Earth rotates. The sun is going backwards in the sky. It was so smooth that you could stand a coin on its edge on the airplane at Mach 2, twice the speed of sound, and it wouldn't fall over, even in a 30-degree bank turn. All of that was really special. I mean, it made it such a wonderful airplane, but it was only an airplane. It was a very, very special airplane, and I think we're all very honored and privileged to have been involved with it. But what really made Concorde special was the people. As I touched upon, the tens of thousands of engineers and designers who thought of it, the people that operated it, the crews, the pilots, the ground staff, the customers that were dedicated to flying it. British Airways flew over 2.5 million people on Concorde. The people in the UK and in the States who would stop and look up every time she flew over. And the people that are still interested in Concorde today, that are really regular visitors to the museums around the world to see Concorde. It's a tribute to them. The airplane was born from dreams and built with vision and operated with pride. And the mere fact that we're having this conversation 19 years after Concorde last flew is indicative of what a very special airplane it was, but perhaps more importantly, what an amazing group of people it touched.
John?
I think Mike has said it all. I mean, I was very honored and privileged to be a part of the team from the British Airways beginning to the end. I flew on the airplane a couple of times before it actually went into commercial service. But it probably was a highlight of things that I've done in my working career. It was absolutely fabulous, and I'm so grateful to British Airways to be a part of that team. And as Mike said, there is this Concorde family that will live on. We're all very, very privileged, very lucky to experience this magnificent creation of aviation history.
Jennifer.
Well, I would like to join the group. I feel that I was greatly privileged, and it was a tremendous honor to be able to work on such a wonderful aircraft, even though it meant getting to the hangar at 5 o'clock in the morning quite often to climb up the gantries, because we had to test out different elements inside the cabin before Concorde was rolled out for its first flight of the day. I'm talking about fabrics for the curtains, the carpet samples, the leather samples for the seat covers, and the accessories, food and beverage for the tray tables. So it was a tough job, and the standards were very, very high because of weight restrictions. We couldn't just use elements that were associated with the subsonic cabin interior programs. For example, on Concorde, British Airways, for the first time ever, flew Trevira curtains. Trevira was a synthetic fabric. It had to be aviation grade, of course, completely tested, weighing only about 6 or 7 ounces per linear yard, compared with traditional drapes, curtains, separating the cabins alongside the dividers, where the weight might have been normally 14 or 15 ounces per linear yard, if we're talking about the traditional wool drapes and curtains. So there were lots of developments, very, very exciting, high tech, and we were able to move ahead at a great rate because of this teamwork that Captain Bannister and John described. So every moment was worthwhile, even 5 o'clock in the morning in the hangar at the top of the gantry. And I think that the legend will live on thanks to these aviation museums that are able to arrange the displays and virtual flights and visits and presentations. The Concorde legend will live forever. And I feel that I was very, very lucky to be part of that process. And it's something that I'll never forget. And thank you, Tom, for raising all these questions, because it's not a simple subject. There are so many overtones and undertones going back over the years. So I hope that this podcast will shed light on Concorde Unique, something that we can all treasure.
Well, thank you. Anybody want to add anything else?
I could say one thing from the PR point of view. You know, as a PR person, sometimes you have to struggle to get one newspaper reporter or one TV crew to come out and cover a particular story. Concorde was just a natural magnet. It was, you know, you couldn't have wished for anything better. So it was such a pleasure and delight and honor and all the rest of the words to describe this airplane. It was a PR wonder.
And at the same time, of course, a technical wonder. I was lucky enough once to have dinner with Neil Armstrong, and we got chatting about all sorts of things. And we got onto his history of a test pilot and obviously his flight to the moon. And we were talking about Concorde, and he said that in his opinion, the technical success of getting Concorde into operational service was right up there with the technical success of putting man on the moon. And as he added, not me, we stopped putting men on the moon in the 70s. When we were having the conversation in the early 2000s, we were still flying Concorde. And he considered it to be a huge, huge technical success that we collectively had managed to succeed in doing it, and were continuing to do it at that time. So it was technically brilliant, and it was socially brilliant and aesthetically brilliant, and we were just very fortunate to be involved.
Well, thank you, Captain Bannister, John, and Jennifer, for your time. We definitely appreciate you taking the time to come on the program, and best of luck to you. And I very much look forward to seeing the Concorde in person in England and Seattle, and also in New York City at the Intrepid.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Tom.
Pan Am was a pioneer in air travel and still stands as one of the most iconic and innovative airlines in aviation history. That legacy lives on at the Pan Am Museum in Garden City, New York, where you can explore the rich history of the aircrafts and individuals at the heart of the company known as the world's most experienced airline. For more information about the Pan Am Museum, check out our website at www.thepanammuseum.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. As was once a tagline in one of our commercials, we would greatly appreciate your support to help the Pan Am Museum continue making the going great. You can also support the museum by shopping on our online store for all things Pan Am, accessories, apparel, jewelry, books, models, and posters. We want to hear from you. If you have a question for us or want to share your story, our email address is podcast@thepanammuseum.org. We are going to close out this episode with the actual ATC radio recording of the final departure of Concorde, with Captain Bannister in command from New York JFK to London Heathrow on October 24th, 2003. As flight crews once said to passengers departing for their destinations around the world, "Thank you for flying, Pan Am."
Kennedy Ground, good morning. For the last time, Speedbird Concorde 2, IFR, London Heathrow, with Mike requesting a Canarsie climb.
And Speedbird 2, I guess for the last time, we can give you that Canarsie climb. Speedbird 2 Heavy, clear to London Heathrow Airport. Kennedy 9 departure, Canarsie climb, radar vector ship. As filed, maintain 5,000, expect flight level 290, 10 minutes after. Squawk 1136, and Mike is the ATIS.
Here at Concorde 2, Mike 1136, thanks very much indeed. And if you could pass on to your colleagues two or three things. Firstly, in a perfect world, we'd like to be wheels rolling at 7:37 local. If we can get a clearance through 105 Alpha direct, that'd be great. But more importantly, if you pass on to all your colleagues here, all the support, and thanks for all the support and help you've given us over the years.
Speedbird 2, on behalf of the controllers in Kennedy Tower, in particular, we want to pass on to Captain Bannister. We hope you have a wonderful flight, and over the years it's been a privilege and an honor to get to work you all every day in and out of JFK, and you certainly will be missed. We hope you have a wonderful farewell flight, and Godspeed, and we will be wishing you all the best as you fly over to London.
That's very kind, and thanks to all of you. I wouldn't want to name any but one who I understand has been with you right from the very first day we came, Samuel Cohen, so thanks to all of you.
Well, he will be talking to you when you be runway, and ground is point 9 when you're ready to taxi. Enjoy your flight.
Ground point 9, Speedbird Concorde 2.
They say 65.
Roger, any chance we can hold short of Juliet behind Speedbird?
Well, Speedbird, like I told the last guy, he's not departing for another 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so. If you want to wait, I could find some place to put you.
Oh, that's okay. Gotta be the on-time machine here.
Yeah, right. Speedbird 2, left turn Golf, right Zulu, hold short of Juliet.
Left Golf, right Zulu, hold short Juliet, Speedbird 2. So long, Concorde, and have a good flight. Thank you very much indeed. That's very kind of you. We're going to miss you here at Kennedy. We're going to miss coming to New York.
Best of wishes from JetBlue.
Thank you.
And from the old Cactus Bird. And Speedbird 2 ground, I've only been here 5 years, but it's not nearly as long as the next guy you're going to talk to, but it's been a pleasure. Hold short of Juliet. He'll get you out right on that release time. You can monitor 119.1.
Speedbird Concorde 2, thanks very much. Ground 119.1, I guess we know who we're going to talk to, but everyone else here has been so helpful and supportive, and we're very grateful for that, and we'll miss you.
Good evening.
Kennedy Tower, Speedbird Concorde 2 Heavy is with you for the last time. Richard, that's great, thank you very much indeed. We'd like to release brakes at about 37 and 50 seconds.
Roger.
Kennedy Tower, American Eagle 830.
American Eagle 830, Kennedy Tower.
Yes, sir. And Speedbird 2's on the radio. We just wanted to pass along a best wishes and Godspeed today. We're going to miss you there. We're just departing LaGuardia. Wish we were over at Kennedy. Okay, that's good to see you. Thanks for that. We're going to miss you all.
American 205. You'll follow the Concorde up at the next intersection. Speedbird 2, you can plan to follow the Express. Speedbird 2 Heavy. Position and hold. Caution wake turbines departing Airbus.
Speedbird Concorde 2 Heavy, between hold 315.
Speedbird 2 Heavy, be advised, I happen to have the good luck of being here and issuing the first landing clearance to the Concorde here at JFK back in 77. Just want to say it's been wonderful working with your aircraft, and I wish good luck to all the crews, and we're going to miss you.
Well, we're very, very grateful indeed for all your help, especially over such a long period. It's been great knowing you, and we're going to miss you a lot.
Thank you. The time now is 3:05. Your discretion. You can roll to find your liftoff at 3:07. Wind 300 at 13. Maintain 4,000. Cleared for takeoff.
Speedbird Concorde 2, clear takeoff 31 left. We're clear to roll to meet our departure time. We'll start the takeoff roll at 37 and 50 and maintain 4,000.
Ground American 699 Heavy.
Yes, sir.
Is there a chance we can hold here at Bravo or anywhere in this area if we're not blocking anybody?
American 699, why don't you transition over to Alpha, and then you can hold on Alpha, and do you need any assistance?
Negative. Hey, ground, can we, American 59 Heavy, can we hold here for a second, troubleshoot something?
Yep.
Thanks. And ground United 3 Heavy, we're ready to go down.
United 3, taxi left Juliet, hold short of Zulu.
Left Juliet, hold short of Zulu, that's it.
Speedbird 2 Heavy, contact New York departure. So long.
Speedbird 2 to departure. Good day, Samuel. So long. Good 2 Heavies with you for the last time.
Speedbird Concorde 2 Heavy, New York departure. Good morning. Radar contact. Climb and maintain 13,000.
Speedbird 2, climb, maintain 13,000. Speedbird 2 left 150.
Speedbird Concorde 2 Heavy, proceed direct to Lind, resume on navigation and climb and maintain 17,000.
Speedbird 2, direct Lind and nav climb 17,000.
Speedbird Concorde 2, I was the first controller to give you the approach clearance and the first flight into Kennedy. So I'd like to thank you and all the crews that have worked the flight through the years for your professionalism. We'd like to wish you good luck as you soar towards the sunshine there to the east. And we just do appreciate all the fine professionalism and hard work that you guys put in through the years, and it was a pleasure for us to serve you.
Speedbird 2, we really appreciate. Thank you very much indeed. We couldn't have done any of this without the support of all of our friends and colleagues in the USA, particularly in ATC in the USA, who've been so helpful and supportive. We really do appreciate it.
Speedbird 2, thank you for those words, and contact New York Center 128 Street. Cheerio.
128.3, Speedbird Concorde 2. Have a nice day.